This is the second. This is the second of the 6 meetings for PIBS 503, also known as PIBS 501 if you're really a PIBS student. And what we're going to be talking about today is some information that came from the first International Congress on Research Integrity, which was held in Lisbon last week. While you guys were sitting in here in a dark room, I was sitting in a dark room in Lisbon. This meeting was a meeting of people from 52 countries all over the world. There were 52 countries represented, and there were working scientists, educators, administrators, government reps. There were editors of Nature, Science, and The Lancet, and J-Cell Bio. There were funding agency reps from every single country that was represented, including the Office of Research Integrity at NIH and the Inspector General Office at NSF. Watchdog agencies, museum science staff, largely engaged in science education at the elementary and high school levels, the World Health Organization, medical schools, universities, lawyers, research institutions, the work. 350 people there at this meeting. And the basic idea was to try to reach some kind of consensus on an international basis on the following topics: research practice in basic and clinical research laboratories, publications. That was a big issue at this meeting because publications are coming under more and more scrutiny for fraud, fabrication, and plagiarism, the big FFPs that worry most international bodies, for databases and trying to encourage more people to put their scientific information into databases that can be accessed worldwide, web-wise. Preventive measures and education, that was another big issue that was discussed. How deeply the problems sink all the way down to the high school level, where 71% of high school students have been self-admitted cheaters over the last couple of decades. And finally, the whole idea of sanctions. So in an NSF survey a couple of years ago, a sizable segment of the US populace think that there's something wrong in science and technology. 56% thought that we depend too much on science and not enough on faith. Okay. 61% agreed that science research these days doesn't pay enough attention to moral values of the society, and this was particularly said after the stem cell debacles. 51% said that science research has created as many problems for society as it has solutions. But the good news in this 2004 data was that at least these numbers are decreasing. So what's the state of research integrity worldwide in 2007? I think all of you have heard. How many of you have heard about this case? Please raise your hand. Yeah, it received a tremendous amount of press. So this is Dr. Hwang from the University of Seoul in South Korea, Seoul National University. And if you look at the right-hand corner of this slide, what you see is the commemorative stamp that was issued in his honor by the South Korean government. And what it shows is somebody in a wheelchair first rising, then running, then embracing his loved one in this picture. And there was an entire South Korean research establishment that was being built around the results, the stem cell results of this one laboratory. And when the beginnings of questioning began by the press, particularly by the South Korean press, the South Korean journalists who first broke this story were receiving death threats. And several of them thought that these death threats actually came through the government. So the fraudulent work that was published on these supposed stem cell lines that were produced in this South Korean laboratory were published in 2 major science papers, one in 2004 and one in 2005. And the frauds were basically pretty simple. But it wasn't the frauds themselves that were the trigger for the investigation. The trigger for the investigation was the fact that the stem cells, the embryos, the eggs that were being used in these experiments, and with a wide eye open for potential therapeutic benefit down the line, actually came from young researchers in the PI's own laboratory. And some of them were compensated, and some of them merely got authorships on some of these papers, which later had to be retracted, because the frauds were pretty simple. Basically, he had one embryonic stem cell, and he cloned it by Photoshop, which I'll illustrate for you in a couple of minutes. And this issue of fabrication and publication arose over and over again during the course of this meeting, and frequently this was one of the examples. So he had a US collaborator, and there was an enormous number of people on this one paper. And one of the questions that was raised during the course of this meeting was, what is the result of a collaborator who doesn't really understand what's going on in the other laboratories that are part of the collaboration? And in general, these frauds were easy to perpetuate because the collaborators allowed their names to be put on the papers, but really had no input into the data. And his chief US collaborator was at Pitt, and Dr. Shatton was among the first to remove his name from the paper before all these papers were actually retracted. And he cut ties with the lab and the team at Seoul. At first, Dr. Huang claimed that he hadn't fabricated anything and that an investigation would prove that he had done nothing wrong, but as the investigation proceeded and more people on his research team, and there were nearly 100 of them, started coming forward with various aspects of the whole process by which the data had been fabricated, he finally admitted in November of 2005 that he had in fact cooked the books. It was after that that the investigation was open, and the science editors had a long meeting, and they discussed that meeting at this meeting, saying that they have now put in place, as have many publications, a vetter of scientific imagery that is sent to papers, particularly for prestigious journals. They receive thousands and thousands of papers, and it's only at the prestigious journals like Cell Science and Nature, the vetting of the images only takes place after there's a conditional acceptance for the paper. But at other journals, all papers are being vetted in this way. So Seoul National University reached a verdict on this case in January of 2006, and the science papers were retracted that were on the human cloning story. However, there was a puppy. Do you guys remember Snuppy? Seoul National University puppy. Cute name. The puppy turned out to be real, so those papers were allowed to stand. Okay, so this is how you clone a stem cell. Basically, you take one picture of a stem cell and you reverse it. You take the obverse, you turn it 35 degrees, and you superimpose it over another stem cell, and you can get 11 human clones, no problem. If you look at the amount of money that the South Korean government, from both private and university and government sources, put into this whole project, or what they had committed 53 million, almost $54 million to building an institute, to building South Korean therapeutic cloning into a place that would be a worldwide mecca for people to come and essentially recapitulate what was on that stamp, stand up from their wheelchairs and walk. By the time the fraud was formally proven and that money ceased, the flow of money ceased, Huang had spent 25 million, about half of it. Okay, so what were the lessons that Herbert Gottwies from the University in Vienna told us we should draw from this from this whole process. Scientific hubris on a national scale in this particular case, but in many other cases that have made national news, perhaps scientific hubris on a less generous scale can lead to fraudulent science. If the idea is that you're building an industry with a therapeutic basis in your country, in your institute, in your university, you can get yourself deluded by how well that science is presented, both in prestigious journals and in national talks. Part of the problem was that the peer review process failed. In neither of the cases of these two science papers did the peer review process, did the editor, did the reviewers catch the problem. And this was all post ipso facto. It was probably almost half a year before all of this came out. Research integrity is increasingly a matter of network integrity. And when we say network integrity, what we mean is those collaborations that are forged worldwide among laboratories. Many of us have collaborators all over the world and are part of large research efforts that are ongoing in multiple laboratories. And you, as an individual collaborator, are responsible not only for your own data, but for understanding and vetting the data of your collaborators. And that's coming more and more into question as time goes by. So science is really done in a globalized world these days. Just as we have globalized corporations, we have globalization of science and technology. And the last conclusion that Gottweis wanted to draw from this was that when dealing with these kinds of cases of scientific fraud, it was absolutely imperative to act quickly to withdraw those papers and to get them out of the scientific literature. I've served on study sections where fraudulent data has been quoted almost 15 years after the initial publication, even though there was a withdrawal. And that particular data that I'm referring to was data that was cooked right here at Michigan. It was a graduate student in Francis Collins' lab who essentially produced the sequence for the human neurofibromatosis, or for the mouse neurofibromatosis 1 gene, just by flipping a few base pairs in the mouse sequence, and published it. He was responsible in the literature for 5 full papers on neurofibromatosis 1. And those papers were retracted by Francis immediately. As soon as he had any indication that that student had fabricated that data, Francis Collins went to the student, got a confession, and the next day he stood on the steps of the Michigan Union and withdrew those papers. And that was considered courageous because there had not yet been an investigation here through the university. And the university lawyers were advising him not to do it. Okay, the chief delegate from Beijing University was discussing some of the problems that have arisen in China recently because there's now a $5,000 bonus for a cell science or nature paper given both the first author, student, or postdoc, and the mentor. There's been a lot of effort to do good science, but there's been some effort to circumvent doing good science by doing the kind of science you could still publish, as illustrated by the previous 2 slides, in cell science or nature, by giving nature a little help. Also, there are some troubling requirements, according to this particular delegate from Beijing University, in that students were expected to publish a paper for every year that they were in graduate school. And several people's PhDs apparently recently have been denied because of this productivity issue, not meeting this productivity quotient. So there were people from 52 countries at this meeting, and one of the things we were expected to try to do was to forge some standards in publication, in education, in research, general clinical research as well as basic science research across disciplines and across boundaries. This was tremendously hard because not even the Europeans could agree on some of the issues. So in some places it was said that plagiarism is basically a victimless crime and why should we worry about it, whereas the Office of Research Integrity here in the United States, that's one of the big three: fraud, fabrication, and plagiarism, FFP. So what's the role of the popular press in all of this? One of the things that was illustrated and discussed among the journal editors and among people who were at this meeting is that the popular press likes simplistic answers. They like to have a story that makes sense to them and that they can produce some hope or some therapeutic promise from the data or the research. And I don't know if you remember, but a number of years ago, there were two major studies that were done on the effects of hormones on cardiovascular health in women. And they came up with two completely contradictory findings. The first study came up with a finding that, that plaque deposition was delayed in people who had hormone treatment, and that the cardiovascular incidence of cardiovascular incidents was actually down in women who were given hormone treatments. The second study, which was done about 5 to 6 years later and involved a much larger number of people, found exactly the opposite, that hormone treatment actually accelerated plaque formation and that cardiovascular incidents were way up in women. And the press seized on this contradictory result in the second study by saying that, therefore, it's like global warming. Scientists don't know what they're doing. These two contradictory results essentially cancel each other out, and therefore we should not trust science because science doesn't give us the answers that we need to stay healthy. And the answer was very simple. The first study was done on women who were largely just postmenopausal. The average age of the women in the studies was about 40, 43. In the second study, the average age was 61. So the problem was easily explained in that it turns out that the patient's age and hormone status before the hormone treatments is essential to explaining what happens. So both results were correct, but the press didn't find that the details of these studies were important enough to publish. So what they hit upon instead of the details of the study was the contradiction in the two studies. Okay, RNA interference. You guys all know the story of the purple petunia. So RNAi was essentially begun by a group of scientists and horticulturists who wanted to produce a purpler petunia. Instead, they got a less purple petunia. They got this wimpy-looking petunia. And that was the first basis for RNAi studies. And now these studies have a tremendous amount of therapeutic promise. They can be used, we think, in treating both human disease and as a powerful tool for discovering disease-related genes. Well, the press is always interested in the future of basic science research, but clinical research papers are not necessarily interested in giving any kind of credit to the basic science underpinnings of the clinical findings. And so there was a big study that was done at Harvard, led by Komaroff from Harvard University, and he went through the literature and he looked at the 10 major health advances in the last decade. And what he found was that of these publications, the relative contribution of basic and applied research to the top 10 medical advances was that basic research contributed essentially to 41% of the publications on which these were based, and applied research about 59% of publications. But in the applied research papers, the clinical papers that were based on these, none of the basic science findings was ever cited. So we're now in an era of the roadmap, translational research. NIH is pushing translational research. They're pushing collaborations between basic scientists and clinicians. We now have a big CTSA here at Michigan, a big clinical research grant, $55 million recently awarded from the NIH for research that has a clinical basis. And I would like to remind all of you that the vast majority of discoveries that come from these advances in clinical medicine have a very large contribution that comes from basic science research. And scientists need to be as good at citing those kinds of underpinnings as they do the basic clinical precedents. Okay, so this was a talk that came from Brian Matheson, who is at the University of Pennsylvania, or sorry, University of Minnesota. And he wanted to stress that the atmosphere of science today is creating an atmosphere in which fraud, fabrication, plagiarism, and cutting corners can flourish because it's a time of tight money. So for most of you who are doing any kind of research, whether it's basic science or clinical research, you know that the NIH is funding fewer and fewer grants, and that we've experienced for the second time in 2 years an actual drop in funding from the NIH in real dollars. So what Martinson wanted to do was he wanted to focus attention on behaviors that are beyond those three major fraud, fabrication, and plagiarism, but that compromise integrity in research. And he wanted to document that many scientists perceive high levels of injustice in the way that resources are distributed among scientists. I mean, all you have to do is listen around any water cooler in the BSRB or in this building, and you'll hear all of us standing around grousing about our NIH funding levels. To demonstrate that these perceptions are associated with behaviors that the scientific community should avoid at all costs, they did a study. So this is a study that actually involved somebody who is now here at the University of Michigan, Ray DeVries, and his colleagues at Minnesota. And in 2002, what they did was they mailed a survey to U.S. scientists, and both biomedical and behavioral researchers, and they asked the scientists surveyed, those people who were funded by the NIH. So these are NIH grantees. And the study was supported by the Office of Research Integrity at the NIH, and they sampled about 1,500 early career scientists from whom they got a 43% response rate, and about a little fewer than 1,800 mid-career scientists. So mid-career scientists are people at the kind of assistant professor level and above, maybe late postdocs, and early career scientists are all the trainees, all of those of you guys who are on NRSAs or training grants. And they basically asked them, first of all, they held a focus group of 51 scientists from all over the world, and they asked them what some of the dubious behaviors were, not the behaviors that were overtly fabrication of data or plagiarism of somebody else's research data, or as in the case of one NSF grant that traveled around the world. So this was a grant application that was sent in by somebody in the UK, and the UK sent this grant application out to people in other countries to review. The next appearance of the same grant application verbatim turned up at the NSF, submitted by one of the reviewers of the initial MRC application. And then that had a third life. So that initial application, parts of which were fabricated at NSF, then turned up partly fabricated at the NIH. So you can see that it's very simple to move across boundaries, both in research fabrication and in grant plagiarism. So what are some of these kind of dubious secondary behaviors that are troubling to scientists? Falsifying or cooking the research data is one of the major worries. Ignoring major aspects of human subjects regulations you'll hear about next week. Not properly disclosing involvement in firms that you're going to profit from if this research gets widely publicized. That's one of the things that most concerns universities and people who give you money. Relationships with students, research subjects or clients that are inappropriate, using another's ideas, unauthorized use of confidential information in conjunction with one's own research, like that traveling NSF grant, failure to present data that contradict one's own previous research. So some people have a little drawer where they keep all the outliers, and you'd be surprised how many Nobel Prizes actually arise from the outliers. The outliers are the interesting data. The interesting data are those points that you can't explain. And once you start delving into them, they can be your Nobel Prize. So overlooking others' use of flawed data, that's the Huang Gate question with all those collaborators. And changing the design methodology or results of a study in response to pressure from a funding source, usually big pharma. Okay, so as I said, all of us are grousing about the status of our NIH and NSF and FDA funding. National Cancer Institute levels have dropped to single digits. GM has dropped to single digits. And the problem is that it isn't just true for R01s or program grants. It's true for training grants. I serve on an NRSA study section at NIH, and the training grant funding levels are parallel to the grant funding at the NIH for R01s. And if we're going to eat our young and basically get rid of the next generation of scientists, I would like to know where the future of American science is coming from, if not straight to Baghdad. So, among the survey items that they asked this group of mid-career and early career scientists was, is peer review perceived to be fair? And that is peer review in publication, peer review in grant applications, peer review through site visits. And the general tenet was that early career scientists, 72% agreed or strongly agreed with the idea that the peer review system of evaluating proposals for research grants is by and large unfair because it favors members of the old boy/old girl network. Nowadays, NIH has tried to combat this by giving extra points or lowering the scores of young investigators. And this has been helpful. The top people in my field are successful because they are more effective at working the system than others. And this is going to arise as a major point later, because one of the things that they found over and over again, and it was discussed at this meeting, was that mentoring is absolutely key to the behavior and the scientific quality of the next generation of researchers. And it trumps everything. It trumps education, it trumps coursework, it trumps that great research that you're doing in the laboratory. Mentorship is the thing that if your mentor takes you aside and says, listen kid, I know how to cut a few corners here, and I know the editor of X journal, or I know how to get your grant into a more favorable study section, or I know that by juicing up the preliminary data by losing the outliers in this particular application will convince the study section to fund it. It's that kind of advice that is essentially trumping anything that we can do on the education side. Okay, so the proportion of each sample who report that in the past 3 years they have observed or had other direct evidence of a colleague using their position to exploit or manipulate others, early career scientists and mid-career scientists were about the same, about half of them. Using another's ideas without obtaining permission, again, about half. Inappropriate or careless review of papers or proposals, less for early career, many more for mid-career because they're doing more reviewing. So sloppy reviewing can be, many of you who are sitting in this audience are editors of journals. And you know perfectly well that there's some reviewers that you can't trust for various reasons. Either they won't send in the review, or they will appropriate some kind of information from the paper that they're reviewing, and they will potentially, in the old days it was easier to delay the outcome or the actual decision on somebody else's paper till you could get yours out. This still happens. We essentially can't judge the extent to which these perceptions reflect reality, but, says Martinson, we should care how such perceptions come to exist. Is the climate of science, is the present funding climate, are the pressures on ordinary scientists, those of us still in the trenches, are these so difficult to circumvent that behaviors that are creeping toward the gray zone or beyond it going to be more prevalent? Okay, so there are local settings, and the climate at your research institute or university is key to your success, certainly if you're on a tenure track or if you want promotion. But more tenure decisions are being made at the NIH these days than ever before. And that's largely because for young scientists, their first competing renewal comes up just about the time they're ready to come up for tenure at research universities. And with the NIH funding lines what they are, there are a lot of worried people who are sitting in the trenches worried about what's going to happen to their futures. Okay, so it's a time of scarce resources, and that does two things. The first is that it doesn't allow a laboratory to maintain itself from one grant to the other necessarily. There are hiatuses in funding, which means reinventing your particular academic or scholarly wheel every time there's a dearth in funding and you have to come back with a renewal where there's a substantial time in which you lose laboratory personnel. Graduate students need to be supported, postdocs need to be supported. And the second is that in times of tight money, study sections seem to take on a less generous mien. So part of the problem is experience in reviewing. If you're a young investigator and your own research grant goes to a young investigator who hasn't got a lot of experience in the system and is feeling less generous and has not experienced the kind of disappointment that you have as an older investigator, you may see your grant essentially triaged. The second point is that people who do phone reviews for national agencies aren't calibrated to the study section, and they tend to be much harsher. So if your grant's reviewed on the first day of a study section, it's reviewed by a young, inexperienced person, and that person's on the telephone, you know you're going to get triaged. Okay, so perceptions of injustice, not just truths about injustice or facts or figures about injustice, are more strongly associated with the likelihood of misbehavior among those for whom the injustice represents a more serious threat to their social identity. That is, you guys, early career scientists. And of those case studies that I gave you guys to read today, they're all real cases. They're all straight off the ORI website. They have names, they have serial numbers, they don't have whistleblowers. And that's one of the things I asked you to think about. Okay, for scientists who perceived injustice in one or more aspect of doing science, they were more likely to report having engaged in one or more of the top 10 bad behaviors. But among those sampled, this perception isn't associated with the likelihood of reporting the misbehaviors of others. So this is all Martinson's data. So the findings of their study with those essentially almost 4,000 folks was that concerns about the influence of the social and psychological environments on behaviors is rising worldwide. Perceptions of unfair review processes at every level are rising. And perceptions of unfair resource distribution are definitely on the upswing. That's because it's the reality. Okay, so what kind of policy response was supposed to be drawn up? That was the job of the people, the 350 people from all these countries who were sitting at this meeting. And one of the things that was obvious was lobbying one's government for more money, or for more equitable distribution of resources, or for trying to change policies that were channeling monies to things other than scientific resources. And the whole idea of peer review at journals and at funding agencies came under scrutiny in that there were many journal editors at this meeting, and every single one of them stood up and said that there is now more scrutiny than ever of papers that are coming through the system. So let's go on to I put this all on the website so you can read through it, but I want to get to the question about education. So two things that I want to talk about before we drop this topic for today. The first is, do classes like this do any good? So we are mandated by the National Institutes of Health to present these classes to you and to make you take them. The reason you're sitting here on a Friday afternoon is because you're either your training program or you're a PIB student, and since your money comes from the federal government, this training is mandatory and you need a certificate that you can waggle in front of your NIH training grant officer and say, I completed the course. It doesn't mean that your mind has to be here, your body has to be here for these 6 weeks. And does it do any good? And the basic bottom line is probably not, unless you're in a good mentoring situation. So the basic findings of many studies, some of which are actually being published in academic medicine over these few weeks, one of which is co-authored by Ray DeVries, who's here now at the University of Michigan, is that while classes like this do a lot for regulatory information, by the time you've been through the next couple of classes, you'll be able to cite chapter and verse on the Helsinki agreements, or what is necessary with animal care, or what kind of IRB meds there are when we review human subject work. Those kinds of things are easily taken in, and you guys are wonderful at memorizing. You can disgorge it all on a quiz if you had to, which you don't have to in this course. What we as educators, people who try to figure out whether these courses are doing any good at all, cannot determine, or couldn't determine until recently, a study was at least hearsay evidence proposed, was whether there was any effect on behavior, on people's behavior who take these courses. And the NIH is betting that there is some effect on behavior, because that's why they mandate these courses. But the answer is that there probably is very little. And that only a good mentoring situation, not a poor one, but a good one, in conjunction with a course like this, where at least you get to hear what you have to say on some of these topics in the small group discussions, has any effect whatsoever on the outcome of your behavior as a scientist, as a working scientist, at any level. And the only people who are sort of still left in the trenches at the full professor level, their FFP ratios are down about 0.02. But if you look through those cases that you got from the ORI today, you can see that, unfortunately, those kinds of incidences are on the upswing in early career scientists. So I'm going to skip over to the conclusions of all of this. You can look at these charts and graphs. And the conclusions are essentially that instruction promotes familiarity with the policies. You can get those off the web. We'll put those research policies on the web, and if you need to consult them, you can find them. But whether they have an effect on the attitudes or the subsequent conduct or misconduct of any person in this room is really problematic. And mentoring in ethics and mentoring in research, and a good combination of those two, is the only thing that seems to lower the misbehavior quotient, whether it's the big three, the FFP, or any of the associated 10 behaviors. Mentoring in survival in science does raise the odds that an early career scientist engages in misconduct. Why do you think that is? That's because the mentor takes the student aside and says, listen, kid, I've got a policy I want to sell you on how to get this research published in Cell Science or Nature. Okay, so this was a talk that was given by Mike Rosser, who used to be the managing editor of J-Cell Bio, and I think you had some of this information that came through from Ormond last week. So journal editors, particularly those who have been burned badly, like the editor of Science who was at this meeting, and editors of Nature who were at this meeting, and editors of The Lancet, all of whom had had big fraud cases in the last 5 years, decided that scrutiny has to become more vigilant at these journals. But first they said the community, the scientific community, not just those 350 representatives from the 52 countries sitting in that room in Lisbon, but all of us have to set some kind of simple, practical, and enforceable guidelines for various kinds of standards. So now they have standards for flow cytometry. The flow cytometry group has gotten together and they produced standards for publication quality flow cytometry data. The community has to be provided with a strong incentive to comply with the standards. And those incentives can't simply be punitive. Sure, we've got the punitive part of this and the enforcement part, but there has to be some basic idea that what you're going to be publishing has to be reproducible, not just in your hands, but in somebody else's. Large data sets need to be deposited in public repositories where anybody can find them, and that goes for image data nowadays as well. So they now have electronic workflow management at many journals, like J-Cell Biology, for example, where the papers receive a huge amount of scrutiny, and they're looking for manipulation of figures in digital images, and they're sending them back. So 25% of all accepted manuscripts have at least one figure that needs to be remade these days at J-Cell Bio. And everybody knows it's real easy to come up with image manipulation, both in the public press and in the data. So this particular response, when they sent this paper back to the PI who had submitted it with these bands that had been nicely erased by the student's response was to the PI, the stamp means you can use the stamp function to remove some background, like these 3 bands here. Everybody does it. This is the Huangate manipulation revisited. So that was a simple cloning stamp. All you do is you take one stem cell and you turn it a little bit, you superimpose it on another, and bang, you've got 11 clones. So more and more sophisticated software is coming out that's being used by journals to detect image manipulation. And now they're pushing for what they call the open microscope environment, which is a standardized database for storing and sharing image data. And they want the raw data. They don't want one where you turned up the gain in the red channel. So obviously if prevention or deterrence doesn't work, there is always punitive action. And I will tell you that at this meeting, there were 4 people from the Office of Research Integrity at the NIH in Washington, and there were 3 people from the NSF, and they were positively gleeful about how well they're doing detecting fraud, plagiarism, and fabrication in grant submissions. What they weren't gleeful about, and smug about, I might add, was the fact that it's on the rise. It's seriously on the rise, and it seems that the more the money tightens, the more it rises. Okay, so I'm going to let you guys read through this. This is essentially how you take a case of research misconduct from the first information that trickles into the PI or to the university and takes it through to the conclusion with the sanctions. And the sanctions in the United States, at least, have all been toward the idea that we are going to sanction people by removing their ability to get any federal funding for 3 to 5 years. Sometimes there's a life ban if it's a particularly egregious case. And we also bar them from reviewing for these federal agencies. So here's the whole list, what happens. So is it too late to educate you guys sitting here? Is it too late to educate those of us who are over the hill in science? Where does the education need to start if it's not effective and if only mentoring has any real major effect? So this is the Josephson Institute. They follow trends among high school kids, and basically all those kids who admit to cheating at the high school level are the people we're admitting to Michigan because they're at the top of their class. And the reason that they say that they cheat is because not only does everybody do it, but they're at a disadvantage if they don't. And that isn't to say that every freshman who walks through the door has cheated in high school. Some of them may never need to do so. But the prevalence of cheating among young kids is really pretty alarming, and it was true all over the world. They had similar statistics from the UK, from South America, from South Africa, from Korea, from Japan, from China. Okay, so, and it's on the rise. And one of the things that was quite interesting was that students who attended private religious schools were less likely to shoplift, but more likely to cheat on exams. And if you were a student athlete, it was really easy to do this, particularly if you were in a religious school. So there was a lot of cheating among student athletes on basketball teams in religious institutions. So where can we potentially start countervening all this? This is the Exploratorium in San Francisco, and here are a bunch of grade school kids, and they're building a model of a nanomolecule. And the idea is, at least among science museum curators who were at this meeting, was that they get the early ones, the really early career scientists, and that if they can inculcate some kind of ethical training into these kids at this age, you know, here's an 8-year-old, here's a 4-year-old. If they can, along with the fun stuff in the science and the blowing bubbles and the, you know, making films and looking at a variety of interesting topics in science, they can throw in a little ethics, then maybe the generation of scientists who's going to be competing for funding in 2050 is going to have a chance. So there's a whole bunch of papers related to this topic at the end of this, which are on your website. And Tom asked me to tell you that he is working very hard on trying to get the podcasts up and running and mounted. And as soon as we do so, we'll let you know. So I'd be happy to entertain any questions if anybody has any. But other than that, please go to your small groups.